welcome to today's Friday Forum on, can't hear? Now can you hear? Oh, the sound of silence. Good afternoon and welcome to today's Friday Forum, which is on domestic violence in Portland, intervention and prevention strategies, featuring Dr. Chiquita Rollins, His Honor Judge Dale Koch, and former Governor and Dr. John Kitzhaber. This program today will be a follow-up on the 1997 Club's research report. Is this like, okay. Sorry, can you cut that piece with my face all scrunched up there? In any case, we're going to be talking about new developments, or they will be talking about new developments in the community in response to domestic violence. But before that, of course, we have our usual City Club announcements, and we're looking for volunteers for a very semi-annual volunteer search to staff our ballot measure studies. It's a really fun opportunity to learn a lot about a specific issue if you're interested in it. The 4 ballot measure studies that have been selected to be studied this year are on the abolition, and these are not the ballot titles, but it's on the abolition of SAIF, the medical malpractice cap, the management of the state coastal forests, and the constitutional definition of marriage. So if you have an interest in any of those, please get in touch with Wade Fickler on the staff, who's our research director, or call the club. Our next forum on next Friday, July 23rd, 2004, will introduce us to our new Director of Libraries, Molly Raphael, and she will be speaking about why libraries matter in the 21st century. And speaking of Molly Raphael, she will also be moderating our Citizens Read Book Club event, which will be held July 26th at the Zimmerman Community Center. And the book we're reading this month is Reading Lolita in Tehran. Very interesting and very topical. If anybody hasn't picked it up, I think you would enjoy it. We are also extending our opportunities to volunteer for something new, and we're partnering with an organization called Hands On Portland. It's a nonprofit organization that connects 10,000 volunteers annually to volunteer opportunities of interest. Along with 10 City Club volunteers, we'll be working together with them on a series of short-term projects over a period of a few months. We'd like to be able to give City Club members an opportunity to volunteer and to become more acquainted not only with issues but with each other. So I think this would be a good chance for you to participate in that. All of the details of these announcements are available online at pdxcityclub.org or in the bulletin. The broadcast of City Club programs this quarter is made possible in part by corporate underwriting from the following: Pacific Air, Zimmer-Gunsel-Frasca, and Portland General Electric. And of course, we're extremely grateful for their support. We also offer copies of today's program on audio, CD, and videotapes. So on to our program, and before we begin, if you have any electronic devices that might peep or crow or ring, would you please be kind enough to turn them off? Our program today features Dr. Chiquita Rollins, who's been in the domestic violence coordinator for Multnomah County since 1994. She's responsible for the development and implementation of domestic violence policy. And in 2001, the Oregon State Attorney General awarded her his annual Outstanding Contribution to Victim Services Award. She's currently a member of the Governor's Council on Domestic Violence and served on the Oregon Domestic Violence Council from 1993 to 1995. In addition, we have Dr. John Kitzhaber. He's a former emergency physician, legislator, and 2-term governor of the state of Oregon. He's the past president of the Oregon State Senate, where he authored and implemented the groundbreaking Oregon Health Plan. And as father of that, I suppose he's a little bit worried about that child right now. In January 2003, Dr. Kitzhaber began serving as president of the Estes Park Institute, which conducts 6 annual educational conferences for community hospitals. He also serves on the director for the Center of Evidence-Based Policy at Oregon Health and Science University in Portland. And finally, but not least, we have the Honorable Judge Dale R. Koch, currently sits as the presiding judge of the Circuit Court for Multnomah County. Family law has been his primary focus for the last 20 years, both in private practice and as a sitting judge. Since 1993, Judge Koch has taught and given presentations both in Oregon and throughout the country on subjects involving family violence, child abuse, and neglect cases. In 2000, the Chief Justice of the Oregon Supreme Court honored him with the Juvenile Court Champion Award. Very distinguished panel, please welcome them.
Thank you, Colleen. Okay. So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's really wonderful to be here and to see so many people that I know and that I've worked with, and to also have the great honor of co-presenting with Dr. Kitzhaber and Judge Koch. We really are pleased to be here and to let you know what's going on in domestic violence these days. I also want to thank you for the excellent report that you did in 1997, Domestic Violence, It's Everybody's Business. That report was a good report to give out to the City of Portland and to the community. It gave an easily understandable analysis of the problem, our current responses, and recommendations for what we should be doing. So I want to thank you for that. I believe that it has been the impetus for many of the developments in the system that we've been doing for the last 7 years since that report came out, and certainly has helped to minimize the funding cuts during these hard budget times to the domestic violence interventions system. So we're not really here to update that report for you, but to remind you of one of your most important conclusions in that report, which is that domestic violence is a problem which is prevented and it can be prevented in a significant number of cases, and that it's going to need to involve the entire community in order to prevent those cases of domestic violence. So today what I'm going to talk to you about specifically is how big is the problem of domestic violence these days, what are we doing about it, and by we I mean what is the government doing, or the city and county doing, and what are the victim services system doing about it, and then how it impacts all of us. And on your table you have a handout that the Family Violence Coordinating Council prepared that gives you some suggestions about what you as individuals or as a community member or as an organization can be doing, and I won't be talking about that, but it becomes sort of the next step after this presentation that we're doing today. So how big is the problem? According to the Portland Police statistics, domestic violence is now half of all reported violent crimes in the city of Portland. That's half of all reported violent crimes. And despite a significant decrease in major crimes in Portland over the last 8 to 10 years, and many of you know this, it's been about a 25 or 30% reduction in major crimes over that period of time, the amount of domestic violence reported to the police has remained about the same number. It's gone down a little tiny bit. And so what that means that as other crimes have gone down, the level of domestic violence reported to the police has remained about the same, and domestic violence has become progressively a larger and larger percentage of violent crime that are reported. And it's not just misdemeanors that are being reported. Domestic violence makes up about 25% or a quarter of all felony level violent crimes are reported to the City of Portland Police. So we're talking about aggravated assault, kidnapping, sexual assault, attempted murder, and homicide. So it's a significant number of the more serious types of violent crime. It's generally 1/4 to 1/3 of the homicides in the City of Portland. Frequently, it is the most frequent reason for homicides in the City of Portland, and I don't think that's going to be true this year because we've been very fortunate to not have very many domestic violence homicides so far this year, and you know there's been a spate of gang killings going on, so I think it's going to not be the primary cause of homicides in the city, and to be honest, that's a competition that I don't want us to be winning. I think one of the things we've been able to do is to bring to bear against specifically homicides, because we know from a lot of different things that homicides are preventable in large measure. And we've been able to bring to bear a large array of services and responses to domestic violence cases, and specifically to some of the more horrendous and high-risk cases that we know about that come to the attention of the criminal justice system. Judge Koch is going to be talking a little bit about he's going to be talking a lot about how the court responds to domestic violence and how they feed into this system of responses. I'm going to be talking to you right now about what are our responses, what is that array of responses that we have that help to prevent domestic violence at the criminal justice side and the victim services side. So one of the main responses is by police officers on the street. And they respond to something between 6,000 and 7,000 police, they write between 6,000 and 7,000 police reports every year documenting a domestic violence crime. They have good laws that back them up, and we continue to tweak the laws to work on them to make them better and more efficient and more able to be used by people in the community. And right now, two of the big issues are getting guns out of the hands of known domestic violence perpetrators, and also to look at how we can increase our prosecution in strangulation cases where we know there's high risk for lethality. We have a court system that Judge Koch will be talking about, and there are specialized domestic violence units in the Portland Police Bureau. There are 9 officers working there and associated staff. In the District Attorney's Office, there are 8 deputy DAs. In the Department of Community Justice, where there are 12 probation officers that specifically work with domestic violence offenders. And these specialized units aggressively and effectively go after the offenders that come to their attention, and it's a very important part and a very effective part of our system. That system, then we have, before I get to that little piece, then we have the victim services system, which includes shelters, culturally specific programs, centralized crisis line, and a newly implemented program that is a non-residential program that does mobile outreach to go to victims where they are to meet them and try to help them meet their needs. Those are community-based agencies that do that. They receive about $2 million from the county and approximately the same amount from state and federal funding sources. So that whole system that I just talked to you about, the criminal justice system and the victim services system, costs the county and the city over $20 million a year. About half of that, or a little bit more than half of that, goes to the jail beds for offenders of domestic violence who are being incarcerated in the Multnomah County Jail. Only about 10% of that goes to victim services. And so that's one of the impacts that we have of domestic violence, and that is that our tax dollars go to dealing with that system. There are other efforts going on that are loosely associated with this, and I want to name just a couple, and there are many more. The Rotary Club of Portland has a domestic violence group that has worked for about 10 years now on this, well, that's too many years, maybe about 8 years on this subject, specifically trying to reach out to employers to give them information about how to respond to domestic violence at the workplace. Optimus International works more on the victim services side to provide support for agencies. Healthcare department, the county health department has a project. There are major healthcare providers in the city have had a project for several years to work on screening and response to their clients. And there are many other smaller projects that are going on like that that are loosely associated with this. The umbrella organization that brings all those efforts together is the Family Violence Coordinating Council in Multnomah County. Judge Harrell is here as one of the people who helped found that in 1987. It allows for coordination, collaboration, information sharing across the multidisciplinary array of agencies that provide these kinds of interventions to domestic violence. So that's basically the formal system of response to domestic violence in this city and county. So why should you care about this? How does it impact you? Well, clearly it impacts you at a county and city funding level, as I just talked about. And so the pressure on the criminal justice system because of domestic violence is significant. Employers see the impact of domestic violence at their workspace in terms of lost wages, in terms of absenteeism, in terms of decreased productivity and increased health care costs, and in some cases in terms of workplace safety, where the perpetrator has begun the harassment and stalking and brought it into the workplace against a victim who works for a specific employer. Domestic violence increases the cost of health care. Is the most frequent reason women go to the emergency room, and it causes immediate and long-term health problems. Domestic violence can also have long-term and severe adverse effects on the children who are exposed to it. And not just the exposure to dad hitting mom, but probably more importantly, exposure to a perpetrator in the family who's doing a variety of other things. And included among those are neglect and erratic and authoritarian parenting, modeling violence as a solution to problems, severing the mother-child, deliberately trying to sever the mother-child bond that it should be there and is an important part of child development, controlling and manipulation of the child, etc. And so exposure to domestic violence is not just about who is hitting who in the family. And I want to say something very clearly about these children who witness domestic violence and live with domestic violence. They're not doomed to follow in the footsteps of their parents. Boys are not doomed. They don't have to grow up to be abusers, and most boys don't grow up to be abusers. Most girls don't grow up to be abused. In fact, many of the people that I know who work in this field, both men and women, do it because they watch their parents, their mother be beaten or their father beat up them, or some violence in their family, and that's why they're doing it. But domestic violence isn't just this abstract thing that happens to people out there. I think we all know people who have been abused or who are abusing. Some of us in this room are survivors of abuse. Some of us are the people who have hurt or tried to hurt our partner. Some of us just know somebody who's very close to us who's been abused. And I frequently get phone calls from people saying, how can I help a friend, a relative, a neighbor, a coworker? And I think it's a really important question. They call because they're afraid for those people. They're worried about those people. Sometimes they're afraid for themselves, depending on how close their relationship is, and they really don't know how to help. And again, that handout hopefully can give you some suggestions about that. And one of the things that we know about domestic violence is that it's a complex problem that requires a complex, comprehensive set of solutions. There's not a single simple solution like, why doesn't she just leave, or get a restraining order, or call the police, or do whatever we think it is they should do. We all have complex lives. Solving the problems for victims of domestic violence and the perpetrators of domestic violence requires this kind of complex, comprehensive solutions. And those comprehensive solutions are not just about the criminal justice system, although that's an incredibly part of the solution, but that really is the system of last resort, and where the real support and the real response should be in the community, embedded at all levels of the community, so that whether it's the neighbor or the friend or the family member, the healthcare provider, the employer, there is support for the victim and a message to the perpetrator that what they're doing is not okay. So in closing, I want to tell you, again, thank you for your 1997 report. Domestic violence is everybody's business. It's an excellent starting point still. It's an excellent starting point to look at this problem and how to address it. This is a community problem. It does require a community response, and it really is everybody's business to do that. Judge Koch is now going to talk to you for a little bit.
Thank you for the invitation to address the City Club on this very important topic. I'm privileged to be here. I'm very pleased to see that Judge Stephen Harrell is here. Judge Harrell is a retired judge in Multnomah County and former president of the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. And he was really the mentor for all of the judges in the state of Oregon in terms of raising our awareness on the issues of domestic violence. He was out there long before this was a popular cause. In 1987, there weren't very many judges anywhere in this country founding family violence coordinating councils in their communities. So I thank you, Steve Harrell. Just to repeat what Chiquita was saying about the 1997 study, I would urge all of you who have not had an opportunity to read that study to read it. It is still a very valuable resource for us in terms of evaluating the work that we're doing in meeting the needs of victims of domestic violence in our community. We've made many changes since 1997, some of those right out of the report. One of the recommendations of the report, increased penalties from misdemeanors to felonies for repeat offenders. At this point, for repeat offenders who have 3 priors, or where the victim is the same victim in a prior conviction, or where there's a child who has witnessed that domestic violence, that offense is no longer a misdemeanor, but it's now a felony offense. By the way, all of these legislative changes were signed by the former governor seated to my left during his term of office. One of the other recommendations, allow judges to require abusers to pay support costs. Well, we haven't totally met that need. The restraining order application process has now been changed so that we can order at least one-time monetary support awards when we issue the restraining orders. The District Attorney's Office here in Multnomah County has worked to create an expedited process for establishing child support awards in cases involving domestic violence. And the court system has developed a facilitation program to assist people who are trying to represent themselves in establishing custody awards and establishing support awards. So we've made some progress there. But as I'm going to talk about, there's a lot of goods and bads out there. And one of the bads is we order the support, or we make the order, but we don't do a very good job then of following up and figuring out how to get that collected. So although we've got some of the tools there, the tools still aren't being utilized the way we could utilize those. One of the other changes that you recommended was allowing judges to award custody of children to mothers as a rebuttable presumption. And now there has been a statutory change that there's now a rebuttable presumption that it is not in the best interest and welfare of a child to award custody to a parent who has committed abuse towards that child or towards the other parent. That's a big step in the right direction in terms of addressing that issue. What other changes have we made since 1997? Well, through the hard work of Chiquita, Rollins, and others in this community, we now have a grant to provide for a supervised visitation program. Unfortunately, that is a federally funded grant, and the money's going to run out for that about the time we get it up and running smoothly. So we're going to be back in the end. As you well know, federal grants, they get you started, but they don't necessarily continue the work. So the community is going to have to assist us in stepping up and continuing to fund that so that we have safe places to provide for visitation in situations that involve domestic violence in those cases where that visitation is appropriate. A court care process. This is really an amazing process. We have a program in Multnomah County where we have a room in the courthouse right next to the family law clerk's office where people can bring their children and drop them off temporarily at no cost while they're dealing with matters in the court. That program is partly funded by the state, by the court system, partly funded by the county, and we appreciate the county's continued support in that. And then this past year, when they had a funding crisis, within a period of about 60 days, the Multnomah Bar Association and others went out and raised $75,000 from the attorneys who practice law in this community to continue the operation of that program and provide stability to that program. And that's really a statement about the commitment of everyone who lives and works in this community. We have, last month, had 130 children who received temporary care in that facility while their parents were in court. More than half of those in situations where the parent was in court in relation to an incident involving domestic violence, either coming down to obtain a restraining order or coming down to testify in a restraining order hearing. And for all of the judges who do that kind of work, and there are a number of the judges from our family court that are here today, we all remember the days and where the little kids would come in with their mothers when the mothers were applying for restraining orders. And I'll never forget the little kid who was running circles around behind me and finally ended up over in the corner flicking the lights on and off in the courtroom. You know, that child was there with a parent who was going through probably one of the most traumatic situations in their life, and the child was just reflecting exactly the situation the child was in. The child should not have had to been in the courtroom, and now we have a place so that the children don't have to be there. The process of obtaining restraining orders. We continue to try to refine that process. The judges in the family court continue to talk to the people who are coming in and applying for restraining orders right at the bench so that people can come up and talk to them privately. Although the matter has to be recorded, it's a public proceeding, but that they don't have to share their story with everyone who's in the courtroom when they're applying for a restraining order. We have a small group of judges in our family court that deal with all of the restraining order matters so that we can provide some consistency in terms of how we deal with both the victims and the perpetrators of domestic violence. Volunteer advocates who assist victims in filling out their restraining order applications. And when funding dried up for that and all of the advocacy groups in our community are suffering greatly from the funding issues that are going on in our state as a whole, they found a way to keep that program running because of its importance to victims of domestic violence. We have a video program where people in Gresham, although again it's not a program that we use as much as we could, where people in Gresham can go to the police station there rather than having to come downtown to go through the restraining order application. Again, we have volunteer lawyers who assist victims of domestic violence when the respondent requests a contested hearing contesting that restraining order. We do a lot of things right. We do some things wrong. We're one of the few states in the country where there's only one time a day that you can come in and apply for a restraining order. There are many places in the country where 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, you can reach somebody to get a restraining order. We routinely order gun dispossession. In other words, if we issue a restraining order against somebody here in Multnomah County, we routinely order that that person give up all of their firearms. If they don't, they're in violation of federal law, and if they don't, they'd also be in violation of contempt in our order. But we still haven't made the connection to find a good way to get those weapons picked up and stored, and we're working with the Sheriff's Office on that issue, and we really appreciate their commitment to solving that problem. We had, for a long period of time, had a victim advocate from the District Attorney's Office who would come in at the time we were issuing restraining orders to talk to people that would be coming in and asking to vacate or modify their order, partly just so we could make sure that they were coming in of their own free will and understood what their options were when they were deciding to request changes in that order. And unfortunately, that's one of the programs that the District Attorney has had to cut. And one of the other things that came clear to me, I was reminded of the other day when I was talking to one of the judges, because of the pressures on our docket, we're only able to give people 10 or 15 minutes when we're having a hearing on whether the restraining order will continue or how it'll be changed. Now, sometimes we can spend more time with people, but oftentimes that's all the time that we have to hear the entire story from both sides about what should happen with that restraining order. And we have to find some way to find some more time on our docket to give people a hearing where they can get out all of the information. We've also continued to refine the process of having one judge, one family. In other words, not most, but many of the people that come into the court system with incidents that involve domestic violence also have other connections with the court system, including the dependency court, where there may be a child abuse and neglect case going on. There may be other criminal cases going on, and we're working to find a way to continue to refine the process that we're committed to of getting all of the cases involving that family in front of one judge so that everybody's receiving a consistent message. And again, oftentimes it's much more important that that consistent message be delivered to the perpetrator in terms of the fact that they're not going to get away with something because they're going to get back and see the same judge next time as well. The District Attorney's Office has continued a deferred sentencing program, which is really a high supervision program for defendants in domestic violence cases, and it requires the cooperation of the District Attorney's Office and the resources of the Department of Community Justice here in Multnomah County. We continue to fight for those resources, and to date the County Commission has been very good in trying to continue the support for those programs, but we'll go right through that same budget problem again next year. And we also have to find a way to get more of the defendants into that program. Batterers intervention treatment standards. By state law now, the Attorney General is in the process of developing batterers intervention treatment programs, so that we're actually making sure if we're ordering somebody into a program that they're receiving appropriate treatment. Again, a law that was signed into place by Governor Kitzhaber. Judicial training. This is an area where it's an ongoing process in terms of providing training for the judges so that they really understand the dynamics of families and understand the dynamics of domestic violence. The National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, which is, by the way, just starting their annual conference meeting at the Hilton Hotel right down the street today. I came from a meeting over there to have lunch with you. Has led the way in providing those trainings nationwide for judges in issues of domestic violence, working closely at times with the Family Violence Prevention Fund in San Francisco for expertise. The state judicial branch provided a series of 5 regional trainings around the state in 2001 that I participated in, going to the judges, not only the judges, but going to the staff of the judges, the staff that work in the courthouse, the people that really have more interaction with victims of domestic violence sometimes than the judges do, to try to educate and continue to educate judges on those issues. This community works very well together. I'm pleased as I look around the audience to see how many people that I've worked with and continue to work with on these issues of domestic violence. And we have representatives from the Sheriff's Office, we have representatives from the Portland Police Bureau, we have representatives from the County Commission, from the local Public Safety Coordinating Council, from judges, from the advocacy community. We have representatives all across this community. The U.S. Attorney is here with us today. All people that are committed to trying to make a difference in terms of domestic violence in our community. But let me tell you, that's not enough. The community needs to participate in this process too, if we're really going to change the culture of our community. We just did a fatality review over the last few months in terms of a homicide that had occurred to a lady named Heather Dunlop in September of 2003, where she was killed in front of her 3-year-old child. And that case is still going through the system, so I'm not going to talk about the case beyond that. But as we did that review, and everybody came to the table, and everybody was willing to talk about their role in contact with that family before that homicide occurred. We learned a lot there. We actually learned some things that didn't apply in that case, but would apply in maybe assisting us in preventing something like that happening to somebody else in a different situation. But one of the things that became very clear to us there was we need the help of the community, we need the help of people's neighbors, we need the help of their family, we need the help of their employers if we're really going to make a difference long-term with domestic violence in our community. Thank you.
Well, I knew there were a couple bills that got past the veto. I appreciate you telling me what they were. Well, thanks very much for the opportunity to be here. It's always a pleasure to be with the Portland City Club. And I'd like to use my time today to try to lend a sense of urgency to this problem, and also to suggest to you that the problem of domestic violence is not something that can be solved solely by a public program or a public agency, regardless of how well funded it might be. It's not a problem that can be solved by private sector initiatives alone or by nonprofit organizations, no matter how well intentioned they may be. The problem of domestic violence is a community problem, and it will be with us until we begin to act as a community to break its vicious cycle. Domestic violence, in a very real sense, is a disease. It is a contagion that is passed from one generation to the next. And it ruins the lives not only of those who are physically injured, predominantly women, but it sets a pattern of violence and dysfunction for children who are exposed to it. Consider the fact that today in Oregon, over 40% of our children arrive at school unable to fully participate in the learning experience because of exposure to risk factors that occur in the home. And one of those risk factors is domestic violence. There is a direct correlation between children who are exposed to domestic violence and to drug and alcohol abuse, which often go hand in hand, and subsequent school failure and school dropout and involvement in our criminal justice system. If there were a disease that affected this many children and families, we would call it an epidemic, and we would muster our resources, and we would respond aggressively as a community. Well, this is an epidemic, and the course and outcome is just as deadly sure, although not from an infectious agent, but from the violence that occurs in people's homes by members of their own families. My message to you this afternoon is a very simple one. This is a problem that assaults our claim to a civilized society. It undermines our communities, it contributes to school failure, and it swells the ranks of those who are in our criminal justice system. We see the aftermath. We all see the aftermath of this problem in our hospitals, in our schools, and in our jails. But there's always that question of whether what we suspect is really true. And somehow it's too often easier to look the other way. But every time we turn away from the evidence, or even the suspicion of domestic violence, we become its accomplices. And every time we expect someone else to solve this problem for us, we become agents and parties to its perpetuation. This is not someone else's problem. This is your problem, this is my problem, this is a community problem, and it requires a community response. But today I think we are losing our sense of community, that cohesive sense of purpose that in the past has allowed us to act in concert. And there's a reason for that. One of the most significant and perhaps underreported things that happened in the last century was the emergence of a strong central government that was created originally in response to the Industrial Revolution, but grew significantly with FDR's New Deal and reached its zenith with President Johnson's Great Society and the enactment of Medicare and Medicaid in 1965. Now, along with the growth of a strong central government came the gradual transfer of decision-making authority from individuals and communities to third parties, to bureaucracies, to the government, and more recently to the courts. And this dependence on third-party decision-making has, in effect, taken individual citizens and communities out of the problem-solving loop. It has fostered the belief that it is someone else's responsibility to solve the problems that confront us as a community. Let's remember that until as recently as 50 years ago, most of American families lived in towns and neighborhoods with extended families and friends. They depended on each other. They relied on their communities. Over time, however, these associations have been diluted, and today more families seem isolated from friends and family and from community life. People move more frequently. Young families are less likely to live near extended networks of friends and relatives. More mothers work and often work more varied schedules. So the old patterns of community life have been interrupted, making it more difficult for families to connect with one another for support. And as this fabric of community life has begun to fray and deteriorate, children and families suffer. And all too often our response to this suffering has been to add more programs and more regulations to fill the void. In short, our response has often been to invest in institutions and in programs rather than investing in individuals. Yet the problems facing our families and our children cannot be resolved by transferring the responsibility to do so to some third party. Now, Ron Heifetz, who is trained as a surgeon and now is a professor at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, has this wonderful analogy, which I shared once before with the City Club, for the kinds of problems that face us today and how we have been trying to resolve them. And it's worth repeating. Heifetz categorizes medical problems into three types. A type 1 problem would be something like bacterial pneumonia, where you come and see me and I give you an antibiotic and you get better. So the responsibility for taking action and solving a type 1 problem rests with the physician, not with the individual. Now, a type 2 problem would be something like cardiovascular disease, where I can give you something to control your cholesterol and manage your blood pressure, but if you don't stop drinking and smoking and change your diet, stop eating that chocolate cake there, start exercising, you're not going to get better. So the responsibility for solving a type 2 problem rests with the individual and with the physician. And a type 3 problem would be something like terminal cancer, where the cancer is not so much the problem as it is the condition. And the only solution is for the individual and their family to work with the physician to decide how best to respond to a set of circumstances that neither of them can change. Now, as Heifetz points out, most of the really vexing problems that confront us today, including the challenges posed by domestic violence and substance abuse and school failure and involvement in the juvenile justice system, are to a large extent type 2 and type 3 problems that cannot be resolved by solely relying on programs and institutions, but require the active, meaningful engagement and assumption of responsibility by individuals in the communities where those problems are manifesting themselves. And let me give you 2 examples. Earlier this year, I was invited to testify before the Portland City Club's Education Committee. And I was struck by the narrow focus of the committee's work, which consisted primarily of lining up different revenue sources that could bring more money into the Portland School District. And that's not a criticism, it's an observation, because the committee, I think, was carrying out its charge. But the point is that this is a prime example of the end result of third-party decision-making, or expecting someone else to solve a problem for us. Because the only thing that was being asked of the individuals in the Portland School District to support their schools was to write a check and send it to Salem and hope some of the money came back to benefit their local school district. Now, in this day and age, you have to admit that's a stretch. Now, I'm not saying that more money is not part of the solution. It is. But so is asking people to do something directly for their public school system. I mean, what if we identified all the at-risk children in the Portland School District and worked to find each and every one of them a mentor? Now, that is something that requires direct engagement and requires a personal investment of time and energy. And it doesn't require passing a tax, and it doesn't require getting permission from the legislature in Salem. I'll give you another example. A few weeks ago, I took Logan up to the new Dornbecker Hospital to have a little keratoma removed from his scalp. Probably should have done it myself. Dornbecker, of course, is one of the most visible symbols of successful community fundraising and activism in this area. We reached the 7th floor waiting room, and while Logan was playing and we were waiting for the doctor, I looked out through this wall of windows across the city at Mount Hood and the sun coming up. And as I stood there in this amazing edifice that was more lavish and opulent than any public school building in the state of Oregon, my eyes drifted across the river to northeast Portland, to the inner city, where children don't get immunizations, where women don't get prenatal care, where drive-by shootings are a nightly occurrence, where young black men are dying from poverty and neglect and substance abuse and despair. All in the shadow of this shining hospital on the hill. Now, I'm glad that Dornbecker is in my community, and we should all be proud of what it is and what it does. But we should also not be blind to the contradiction that it represents, or the fact that much of what we treat in our hospitals is the aftermath. It is the symptoms of the problems that occur in our communities and in our homes. My point is simply that we will never, ever end domestic violence by simply raising money for programs and institutions. We need to invest time and energy in one another. We need to strive to raise public awareness and to ultimately change public attitudes so that domestic violence will no longer be a crime that we overlook or tacitly tolerate simply because it happens in the privacy of a home. We need to open our eyes and our ears and our minds and our hearts, because as long as we refuse to see and hear and understand and feel the full force of this epidemic, and as long as we fail to see that it is a community problem, we cannot hope to heal the scars that it leaves on all of us. If children are our greatest resource, then they are also our most accurate record. Not only do they carry within them the shape of tomorrow, they also bear witness to our own values and choices. Oregon poet Kim Stafford put it well in what he calls Lloyd's story, which I will close with. His words speak far more eloquently than I ever could to our challenge and indeed to our responsibility to act today as individuals and as a community to prevent the long-term consequences of this epidemic from reaching far into the future. Lloyd Reynolds, the international citizen of Portland, spent his last days in pain, silent, unable to speak or to write, lying in a hospital bed. On his last day at home, as his wife scurried to pack his suitcase for the hospital, Lloyd made his way outside to the garden, and there she found him on his knees with a spoon. awkwardly planting flower bulbs. Lloyd, she said, you will never see those flowers bloom. He smiled at her. They're not for you, they're not for me, he said. They are for you. The salmon coming home, they're for you. The calls of the wild geese, they're for you. The last old trees, they are for you and your children and your children's children to the 7th generation and beyond. They're all blooming into being for you. Thank you.
Well, it's hard to speak when I'm all choked up, but we've come to the question and answer period, and I would like to remind members that the questions are to inform the discussion, and they should not be the members' opinions, and they should be asked succinctly in hopefully less than 30 seconds. And our board host today will be Mike Burton. He's a member of the Board of Governors. He's also Vice Provost and Executive Director of Extended Studies at Portland State. Mike served for 8 years as the elected executive officer. He served for 8 years as the elected officer of Metro, and he served the House of Representatives for 5 sessions. Is that good enough?
That's good, thank you. And actually had some bills that you signed, John, so I appreciate that too there. Governor Kitzhaber, Judge Koch, Dr. Rollins, I would very much appreciate the depth and breadth to which you've explained the response going on right now. The 1997 City Club report, as you pointed out, was titled Everybody's Business. And my two-part questions to each of you revolves around how each of us can directly get involved. I went on the internet yesterday trying to find out a little bit more about domestic violence and entered that as a lead-in, and 1,219,000 some odd responses came up. When I began to narrow it down to organizations in the United States dealing with this matter, I think it ended up at about 14,000. I just started cruising through some of those, and quite frankly, some of those sites appalled me. They were all over the place. Some of them looked good. I wasn't too sure. But what my question is if you can recommend how an individual can begin to get at this type of information for good, clear information, where we might go, what kinds of organizations we might become associated with if we want to do more about this. That's the first part of the question. The other one is a much more individual base. As a friend or an employer, as you mentioned, if you suspect something is happening, what's the best approach? I think a lot of people are hesitant to do that because there might be a legal line crossed or a personal invasion felt. But it is important that we do take action because we can't simply suspect and not let it go. So those two questions are my start off.
Maybe I'll just briefly address the first part of the question, and Chiquita could address the second part of the question. The county has an excellent website in terms of getting information about what's going on with domestic violence in our community. The National Council for Juvenile and Family Court Judges has an excellent website. The Family Violence Department of that organization has an excellent website to get information. The Family Violence Prevention Fund in San Francisco is an excellent place to get information regarding domestic violence and the dynamics of domestic violence. There's also a website at the University of Minnesota that really focuses in on domestic violence and its impact on children. So those are all good places to get some just good basic information and to have some links to some other websites regarding that type of information.
And in terms of the second question about what can you do if you suspect that a friend or relative or someone you work with is being abused, I think the thing to do is to ask them, and ask them in as caring a way as you can. And I think the reason you would be asking is because you do care. So simply say, I'm worried about you. I noticed that you came in with bruises on your arm, or that you're missing a lot of work, or you seem to have discord going on in your family. Can you tell me what's happening? If they really have bruises, they're very indicative of domestic violence. Say, I'm afraid someone's hurting you. Physicians in particular and nurses in particular have the ability and the opportunity to do that. I'm afraid someone's hurting you. This looks like the kind of injury if somebody hit you. Call it out for what you see it is. And so that's one thing. believe them, know that they're only going to be telling you a tiny, tiny bit of what's been going on, and that they're going to be testing you. So they're going to say, oh, gosh, Joe and I, we just had a big fight last night. And they would drop it there, and you can ask a follow-up question. Well, you had a big fight. What happened? Oh, he got really mad, and he threw something. We threw something. Did it hit you? Were you hurt? No, but and just keep asking those open-ended kinds of questions, and they will slowly give you some more information. So believe what they're telling you. No, it's not the whole story by any means, that it's usually much worse than what they're talking to you about. Offer them whatever resources you can, crisis line phone numbers. We have little pocket cards that we provide to lots of different people. Healthcare providers in particular use them. Have them in your place of business, have them available. Make sure you keep the door open and say, if there's anything I can do, come back and ask me. And then we have some information about safety planning, how you can help someone safety plan, what kinds of very specific, tangible things you can offer to help someone with, which I think probably goes beyond this question at the moment. So.
Joe Smith, City Club member. I was very concerned to hear the judge say that the district attorney's victim counseling program had ended, because 3 decades ago, when I was prosecuting, perhaps the most frustrating thing I had ongoing through my term was the number of times a woman would come in having been beat up, and we would file the appropriate complaint, and 2 days later, 3 days later, she would be pleading, insisting that we had to drop the complaint. It was just really frustrating, and I'm wondering, is that still a significant problem? If it is, what specifically is being done to address it, and what more might we be doing to address it if it is still a significant problem?
I didn't mean to imply that the Victims Assistance program in the District Attorney's Office has gone away. That program is still there and very much alive. But what we were doing in the family court, we're asking that victim's advocate to be present at 1:30 in the afternoon when we were having people come in and ask to lift restraining orders, not drop criminal cases, and asking them to meet with those people that had restraining orders before they met with the judge to talk with them about vacating that restraining order. And in response to, I think, the second part of your question, Joe, yes, it is still very much an issue with victims of domestic violence deciding that they did not want to follow through with the prosecution. Oftentimes that's just a symptom of the fact that they feel that they are going to be in more danger to themselves if they follow through with the prosecution than if they back away from the prosecution and do everything they can to get that case dismissed. And maybe Chiquita could respond to that.
Yeah, I want to add a couple other things, one of which is actually the number of victim assistants in the district attorney's office in the last several years have gone from 9 or 9.5 down to 5.5, and 2 of those are grant funded. So there's been a significant reduction in that. And you all know there's been county cuts over the last 2 or 3 years, and that's been part of the fallout of that. But one of the things that we're doing with the Portland Police Bureau in particular through grant-funded positions is pairing police officers with community-based advocates who then can do much of the support and the getting of other kinds of resources that the victim assistants used to do. And that's been a very successful program that has somewhat taken up that slack, but certainly that's a big loss.
Josephine Pope, City Club member. This is a sort of a follow-up on John Kitzhaber's point about non-governmental solutions or non-tax source solutions to the problem. One comment, it seems to me that most people, I don't know, but that most people who are abusers don't start out in life to be abusers, and that 2 significant qualities of what leads to domestic abuse. One is drug and alcohol abuse, and my question peripherally is, would decriminalization of drugs help this problem? Secondly, it has to do with unemployment, or underemployment. That is the frustration that comes with the head of the house or anyone not being able to do what we all like to do, that is to support our obligations.
Define the universe in 30 seconds. I'll just touch on these both real briefly. I personally don't believe decriminalization of drugs is going to solve the problem. It solves some problems it might get at the drug trade, but it still doesn't address the devastation that the abuse of substances takes on individuals and on their families. So I don't really believe that is the answer to this particular problem. I think your second point is very, very relevant. When I was in Roseburg practicing ER medicine in the early 80s, I was there when the real recession hit, and the timber industry really went belly up, and our unemployment rate was over 26% in Douglas County. And I remember seeing the consequences of proud individuals who had always worked for their living who can suddenly not provide for themselves and their families. And it was an increase of substance abuse. It was an increase in domestic violence as a consequence of that. And I think that we really miss the boat if we don't recognize that one of the fundamental causes of not just substance abuse and domestic violence, but a whole host of issues that face this nation is our unwillingness to provide good, solid economic opportunity for all of our citizens, and simply lets this enormous gap between those at the top and everybody else widen. And that obviously is nothing we can address here immediately, but I do think it needs to be thrust into the debate at every opportunity, and I appreciate your doing that.
Mayor Mandel, City Club member. I hate asking the type of question I'm about to ask, but I think in this instance it has to be put forward. Do you think the repeal of this last 2 years of Multnomah County's income tax will have an effect on domestic violence programs?
Well, it's my understanding, the courts are funded through the state as opposed to the county, so it won't have a direct impact on the court, but it clearly will have a direct impact on the public safety resources in our community, the sheriff's office, the number of jail beds that we have available, the district attorney's office in terms of the number of prosecutors that are available, and the Department of Community Justice and the resources that are available to supervise people who we've placed on probation.
In addition, I believe it'll have an impact on victim services funding that the county does also. And John Ball is here, and maybe he would like to add some more, maybe not, though.
One of the points that I just want to emphasize, we were talking about it earlier, is that there's this widespread belief, it's very widespread in legislative circles, that if you just stop paying for social services, the people who depend on them somehow disappear, and you can avoid the cost. We saw a great example of that philosophy in action a year ago when they cut prescription drug coverage for portions of the health plan, and that gentleman who needed $14 a day to get his seizure medications ended up with a sustained grand mal seizure on a ventilator in a Portland hospital, eventually died, a bill of about $1 million, which was billed back to the state. I mean, these are our friends and neighbors. They're not statistics. They're not problems. They're a part of the community. And if we don't take care of them on the front end, they end up in our jails, they end up in our mental health system, they end up in our emergency departments, and we pay a lot more both in economic and human terms. And I think it's really important for us to recognize that.
Question for Dr. Kitzhaber. Dr. Kitzhaber, you are well aware that there's a law in Oregon that if a physician feels that a person should not be able to drive, he's required to report it to the DMV. If a physician treating a woman with a black eye and a bloody nose, whose husband beat her up that night with or without a six-pack, realizes that that husband is at fault, should there be a law requiring him to report to a court that just the way they required the doctor to report to the DMV? Would that be of any help? What's your response?
Well, I believe there is a law that requires physicians to report suspected child abuse. I would have to refer to the judge to tell me whether there's one that requires you to report domestic violence, but I don't know that there is. There should be. I recall Dr. Kemp, who I believe when I was training in Colorado was the physician who coined the term battered child syndrome, that pattern of bruises and fractures that suggested child abuse, used to tell us that no family died of embarrassment and that you should over-report rather than under-report because the consequences of missing this are so devastating. So if there is not such a law, there should be one, and I would certainly be a vocal proponent of it.
The only thing I would say is I would be careful about such a law unless you also assure that you have in place adequate resources to protect that victim of domestic violence from the response of the perpetrator once they find out that report's been made. So it's a very kind of dangerous road to go down.
We have time for one more short question.
Katie King, City Club member. And the question that I have for each of you is, what was the turning point that made you become more active on the domestic violence prevention front?
My turning point was sitting right down there to the left of you, Judge Harrell.
Well, I think it's an issue that I became very much aware of both as an intern and as a practicing physician in a rural community that was undergoing enormous economic dislocation, and it became very, very clear to me that, particularly when you practice in the emergency room, that's sort of the provider of last resort. It's increasingly becoming the crucible where all of the social failures in our community show up, and it's very, very clear that this is a major problem, and so I guess I would say firsthand experience of the medical lines.
And I would say my turning point was in the late 70s during the women's liberation movement, when feminism started to talk about sexual assault, domestic violence, and violence against women and its impact on women, and how deeply embedded in society it can be. And that explained to me a lot of things I'd seen as a child and growing up and in my later life. So that was sort of the turning point.
Thank you so much for a very enlightening and touching presentation today, and we are adjourned. See you next Friday.